Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Paul Resnick, and I'll be your moderator today in this college-wide discussion. Our panelists are mostly here. We're missing, well, I was just going to say, Scott Paulson. Well, he's coming from ICC North, and I was going to just say that he was rushing to get here, and hopefully...
Don't say Russian. That's bad. Don't say Russian.
So, the college-wide discussion of hate speech, but first, really, wouldn't we rather discuss something else? You know, I was thinking about love speech. How about we just talk about love speech today? We could start with Shakespeare's sonnets, move to Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, and that'd be a lot more fun, wouldn't it? But we're not, alas. Today is not the day for that. Today is the day for something else. Before we hear from our panelists, I'd first like to thank the members of our Humanities Department In-Service Committee, Megan Ames and Aaron James, Margot Vance, and Deborah Wilson for their work to make this event possible. I'd also definitely like to thank Malia Heath, if you'd raise your hand, and Jennifer Swartout for their help and encouragement throughout this whole process. And of course, I'd especially like to thank our panelists for volunteering their time to share their expertise with us today. This will be taped, and if you notice, there's mics on both sides of the room. Each panelist will have 10 minutes to come to the podium today and say a few words. And then after all 5 of them have talked, then there'll be a time for questions and answers. If you notice, there's papers on everybody's desks. If you do have a question that comes up during one of the panelists or all of the panelists' talks, then please write them down and give that half sheet of paper to Megan or Aaron. Would you raise your hands? So give that half sheet of paper to them. And I will read some of those questions to the panel. And also, if you want to just come up and state your name and go to the mic, you can do that as well. So there'll be plenty of time for question and answer around 4:30. So, but first, before I introduce the panelists and before they come up here, I would like to just say a few words about a video clip that I'm going to show this group. So the purpose of our panel discussion is to inform our colleagues where the boundary lines are between hate speech and free speech. And closely aligned with that, what recourse faculty have if students cross the line on hate speech, how to intercept it before it becomes an issue, and the process if events get out of control in the classroom. The audience today is principally faculty and staff. If students come in, then that's fine, but it's principally for faculty and staff. The genesis of this event happened at our Humanities Department meeting when a colleague asked about a situation in the classroom where someone wears an offensive shirt or someone has written hate speech on our marker board. What is our proper response to these incidents? Hopefully these questions can be answered today. The panelists know their remarks are to inform and educate us, and I look forward to hearing from each of them. After these remarks, I'd like to show a brief video clip right now. It's about 6 minutes long, and let me give you a little context to it. This is from UCLA. There seems to be a lot of these panel discussions nowadays. It's titled Free Speech versus Hate Speech on College Campus. In this particular excerpt, Dr. Kevin Johnson, who's a communications professor and director of the Center for First Amendment Studies, discusses 3 types of responses to hate speech in the context of an anti-Semitic web posting by a UCLA student. Next, we'll hear from a student and a chancellor from Chapman University, and they'll weigh in as well. So it's about 6 minutes long, and I think this will whet our appetite for today's discussion.
In any particular case that we have, there's at least 3 levels that are of concern. On the first is the primary level, which is the unique instance of the text like we read, and there are awful types of texts that we come across. The second level is the laws and policies that we have in place. And the laws and policies have to be vague enough in order to apply to speech, but not to be overly broad so that it restricts political speech. And that's the challenge that legislators face and school administrators face. And then the third level is we have to have people that interpret those policies. And if those people in power want to silence one particular side and not apply it in another side, then we don't have a real debate on a lot of the issues that are brought out.
But we were saying, it feels like, I mean, what you talked about, Liat, is that post could represent a true threat to Jewish students on campus because it promotes violence. So then how do you define hate speech on campus?
Yeah, so I think on our center's website you'll find a white paper on hate speech and using kind of the harassment model. And one of the things that I think needs to be documented is this material disruption to the learning environment. There's a lot of effects that some studies are beginning to indicate that hate speech has particular consequences to student development and to student success and maybe some dropout rates. And if those studies start to correlate, then maybe the Supreme Court would revisit this material disruption standard to be able to figure out if it's still viable.
Wow. Dr. Strupa, it seems like it's always been a tenet of universities to have robust speech. I think that it's moving away from that if you can't say things that are threatening, okay, that's not robust, okay? Now, clearly, if there's a clear danger, someone's a nut, they're going to do something. But, as offensive as what that person wrote, I agree. I was offended when I read it. But I'm thinking, this is a college student. This is someone who's like 20 years old. Maybe they can be talked to. That's what a university's about. Come out, express yourself. How do you feel? And maybe make it a teachable moment.
Chapman, we have approved, when I say we, it means the Board of Trustees, the administration, the faculty, the students. We have approved a very strong statement on free speech. So for us, the protection of speech is the most important thing. So even when it's horrible, in fact, that's kind of the only speech you need to protect. Essentially, speech doesn't have to be offensive. That's the reason for the protection of speech. There are, of course, issues that have to do with harassment or with the damaging of the educational experience, and I think that's an interesting direction. But I think as a university, we believe that the robust discussion, as you indicate, is the most important. Part of the problem with suppressing speech, there are two major issues that concern me. One is, of course, who decides what's hateful speech. It turns out the people in power will make the decision. So the idea of putting a boundary on what is protected speech is really, in fact, repressive in nature. The second issue is that even when speech is hateful, when you suppress it, you suppress also the ability of others to speak against it. For example, when Lee had brought up the issue that happened at UCLA, this opened up a discussion. And now we are here, and there is an opportunity for us to express our support to the students. So I think...
Which is, you're right. I mean, that's positive, Professor. But let me show you another example, okay?
Please.
Here's another example of the fight between hate speech and free speech. In 1998, the University of Connecticut expelled a student who posted this notice on her door.
Yeah, it listed, in her opinion, people who should be shot on sight. And the list included bimbos, racists, and homosexuals.
So she was expelled from the college, okay? But the federal district court reinstated the student.
Because her First Amendment rights had been violated.
Your take, Professor Johnson? I mean...
Well, I think that when we're talking about the issue of the speech itself, as a person who studies argument, we never really get at what is underlying this hate. Why is it that people are so hateful toward these other people? And in this particular context, what is it about your frustration with other identities or other people who are not like you, and how do you communicate that in public? And we never get to those undergirding issues.
But I mean, I think it's fear and it's ignorance, truthfully, at the end of the day. But at some point, if it represents a true threat, I think that's where you're crossing the line. I mean, Leah, part of what you talked about is social media. This is the way young people speak. So then what do we do to regulate it? I mean, do you feel like we do need a new law?
I don't think we need to regulate it, but I think it helps us find that there's a problem, and a problem that the university needs to take responsibility to address. So when they see attacks on social media happening amongst students, which is very much a part of our campus climate, even though it's virtual, it's our students are taking part of it, which makes it part of that climate.
But they're personal accounts. Right?
Right, but they're listed as UCLA students. They're listed as UCLA faculty. So their associations are public information, and that makes it part of the university climate. So at that point, it's the social responsibility of the university to address it with supplemental education, with meetings, with conferences, to teach students about harassment, to teach students about racism, so they know how to conduct themselves. And then it's up to them whether they want to have the consequences of hate speech if they want to, isolate themselves from the rest of the UCLA community, with whether that's something they want to be part of.
And,
is that
Leah,
feasible?
we have had this.
I mean, is
when-
that feasible?
I particularly like the material disruption standard that the first speaker talked about, and I love what the students said about at the end about educating. But anyway, that's all food for thought as we listen to our panelists today. And I'd first like to introduce Rick Joseph. Rick is an attorney who has concentrated his practice in representing municipalities, park districts, school districts, and other public law clients for over 32 years. He frequently speaks at seminars directed to elected and appointed public officials on various matters, including free speech. Rick also serves as a general counsel for ICC. So let's give a warm welcome to Mr. Joseph.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Paul, and thank you everyone for having me here today to speak to you. As Paul indicated, I am the general counsel. Will I disrupt everything if I shut this?
No, go ahead.
But I'm the general counsel for ICC, so I have to start off, as all lawyers do, with a bit of a disclaimer. My remarks here today are mine. I may be referring to some of ICC's policies in this regard, but I have not spoken to the administration or to the board about this. And so what I'm going to do today is to give you my opinion, but I'm going to start with what is the status of the law. There may be others here on the panel who are advocating for one position or another, or will have opinions on one position or the other. My purpose here is to let you know what the status of the law is, give you some of my opinions that may help frame some of the issues. With that in mind, I want to start off by saying that this has been a very hot topic. And when Paul asked me to speak, you start doing some little bit of research, and you find just how prevalent this discussion on what is hate speech, what is free speech is. It permeates not just the media, but basically you can't type in hate speech in Google search without coming up with dozens and dozens and dozens of articles. But one struck me, and again I remember this because it was in June of this year, where the mayor of Portland, Oregon, Ted Wheeler, in response to a question from the media in regards to a demonstration of what he termed an alt-right group, said that they have the constitutional right to speak, but hate speech is not protected by the First Amendment. So, since I get to talk to you, my chance, I want a show of hands. How many people here think that Mayor Wheeler was correct, that hate speech is not protected by the First Amendment? One person? Okay. Well, that's a good question, but Mayor Wheeler did not define what hate speech was. So, okay. Well, let me tell you that Mayor Wheeler is wrong. Neither precedent nor history supports his position. The Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that speech, all types of speech, no matter how repugnant, no matter how vile, is still protected speech, and it's protected by the First Amendment. Now, in response to your question, what is hate speech? The Supreme Court has not defined. There is no legal definition of hate speech. People have used various terms. I mean, the one that I think is most commonly accepted, but again, the devil is always in the details as to the nuances, is that hate speech is speech which attacks or insults a person or a group of people on the basis of race, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, or some other trait. So that is the definition that I think is commonly well accepted. People have nuances that approach various aspects of that. But the key factor is hate speech is speech, and you have to look at it in terms of speech. We're not talking about what are hate crimes, which are actionable. There's federal statutes in regards to hate crimes. No, this is speech. So allow me to be basic for one moment. And I know this is way beneath all of you, but I have to say that the First Amendment states, and I quote, that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Okay? That is one of the basic tenets of the United States, and it's where all of these aspects start from. And our founding fathers put that language in the Constitution in part because they didn't want to trust that the government would be the person to say whose viewpoints could be expressed, who could be heard, and who was not worthy of being heard. And so that's that language. My law school professor in constitutional law class used to say, you know, wouldn't it have been nice if the founding fathers would have actually wrote down what they meant when they said these things? Well, the fact of the matter is they didn't, and they couldn't, because what was right in the 1700s is not right now. And so, again, changing technology, you have to look at what the concepts are. So we look at the aspect of hate speech is free speech. And you start from the premise that all manners of speech are protected and worthy of equal protection under the law. You may agree with it, you may disagree with the speech, but they're all worthy of the same degree of protection. The seminal case in this is the RAV versus City of St. Paul case. It's a 1992 U.S. Supreme Court decision where a 14-year-old boy comes out of the juvenile court system in St. Paul, Minnesota. The boy was charged with a Minnesota criminal law making it illegal to place on public or private property a burning cross, a swastika, or other symbol likely to, and the language of the statute was, arouse anger, alarm, or resentment in others on the basis of race, color, creed, religion, or gender. This young man was charged with burning a cross on the lawn of the only black family in his neighborhood in St. Paul and was arrested. Matter went through the court system. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the law was unconstitutional, that he could not be charged with that statute because it singled out, because it was not content neutral. The court did not say he could not be charged with or found guilty for his act, meaning that if it was criminal damage to property or something like that, that's completely within the boundaries of the law. But he was charged with a statute that limited his speech to matters, or prohibited speech or his activities on matters that were on the basis of race, color, creed, religion, or gender. And because it was not content neutral, because it wasn't uniformly applied in a wide variety of circumstances, the court held that that type of speech, no matter how vile we may find it, no matter how bigoted or repugnant, is still protected under the First Amendment. And Paul, you're going to give me a hook when I'm approaching my time here.
Yes.
Okay. And am I? 3 minutes. Okay. So to jump ahead, what can you do when you have free speech issues? Now, you have to, the law is such that any regulations on free speech have to be content neutral. So we look to the aspect of what is free speech, and you have 3 different types of forums. You've got the public or traditional public forum, limited public forum, and a non-public forum. Let me give you a couple bits here. Traditional public forum is what people usually think about when they picture the guy in the park holding up a sign and orating. Okay, parks traditionally are, governments say, open public forums. Anybody has the right to express all of their views there. Some people would say that college campuses are traditional public forums. History is such that college campuses are for purposes of free expression of ideas. Nobody should be afraid to express what their ideas are. And so once you have a traditional public forum, the only way that the government can limit free speech in that regard is for reasonable restrictions where there is a compelling, overwhelming governmental interest. But the key factor here is any restrictions still have to be content neutral. One is free to make fun of Lebanese people as myself, just as they're free to denigrate any other ethnicity, just as one is free to say that you don't agree with and blast the Democrats or the Republicans. Every item of speech is equal in terms of the idea for protection. With one exception, And that's going to be probably some of these things other people are going to speak of here, but that's what the government calls fighting words, okay? Where a word is so, rises to the level of being a fighting word, courts have carved out some limited exceptions. Now, much like they haven't defined what hate speech is, they also haven't defined what a fighting word is. And so you're left in this nebulous land in terms of wanting to know or needing to know how to react. My time is up, but I want to say one other thing, because the comment in terms of the speaker where they talked about the material disruption standard, great idea, great concept. It goes back to the issue of traditional public forum and limited public forums. But that case that the speaker was referring to, and I have a note in that regard as to what that is. Here it is. It was the case of Tinker versus Des Moines Independent Community School District, where there the Supreme Court held that the material disruption of classwork and class standards is something that the school could rely upon for purposes of restricting speech. But I caution you, that was a high school, and there's a big difference between a high school and a college. Courts haven't ruled upon this recently, but think how different it would be if this was a college that had that discussion. So, thank you for going overboard, or thank you for listening, and I'm sorry for going overboard.
So each of the panelists know they have 10 minutes, and so he did a great job with this time. Our next speaker is Scott Paulsen. Scott's a professor here in the business department. He graduated from Illinois State and from the University of Iowa College of Law. He's licensed to practice law in Iowa and in Illinois before the state and federal courts, including membership in the bar and U.S. Supreme Court. So let's give a warm welcome to Scott.
I'm going to sit here and give my remarks because I have a microphone anyway.
Okay.
And those students who came in last, those are my students from my 215 class who we raced over and I beat you all. So I agree with counsel basically that the term hate speech is not present in the glossary of any terms of Supreme Court of the United States jurisprudence. The United States Supreme Court has never decided a case on the constitutionality of hate speech. In fact, by most definitions of the terms, hate speech is constitutionally protected. The exception that counsel mentioned regarding fighting words, generally that must be words that incite or are likely to incite imminent lawless action. So basically, face-to-face insults addressed to a specific person likely to start a fight kind of thing, or threats of illegal conduct or incitement intended to produce imminent legal conduct. And generally, that comes then to our friends over here in blue, who, as I've told my class, have the good job of trying to decide at what point, factually, things have escalated to the point where a fight is imminent. Good luck. That's your job. So, along those lines. The other thing, though, I want to mention is because I knew Rick was going to talk kind of on the law, I'm also going to put on my hat as a teacher of business statistics. And a very recent Brookings Institute survey from August 2017, preliminary results were announced on September 18th, and I've passed around little pages that say the numbers. The first question that was presented to a sample size of 1,500 college students was, does the First Amendment protect hate speech? And the statistics were, and I have a demonstrative because that's what teachers do, 39% said yes, 44% said no, and 16% didn't have my class yet, so they didn't know. But basically, the statistics show you that 60% of those college students were wrong, that the First Amendment does not protect hate speech. So you can say things, basically, but you can't be constitutionally prohibited from saying it based on the content. And another famous case that we just went over is Snyder versus Phelps, where members of the Westboro Baptist Church protest at the funeral of a Middle East veteran who had been killed, and with signs that say, for example, God hates fags and the like. And the United States Supreme Court, in an 8-1 decision, said that is not prohibited speech. Now, we can regulate the time, place, and manner of that speech. The speech was on a public sidewalk, not at the funeral home. There were signs that were allowed. There was no blow horns or bull horns to make the signs or the noise excessively loud, and government can regulate those sort of things. But generally speaking, that speech was allowed because it was general in nature and conveyed a general argument. It would be different, for example, if they, instead of had a sign like that, said, Scott Paulson is a pious asshole. Now I have a cause of action, but that cause of action goes to me. That is defamation or slander, and I have a civil cause of action that I can sue those people for. But the question is, when does the state, when does the government become involved? And here at ICC, we are a state institution. So the next statistics from the Brookings Institute survey is interesting. A student group opposed to a speaker, or a speaker is invited to an on-campus event. The speaker is known for making offensive and hurtful comments. The survey included a set of questions concerning the students' views regarding actions aimed at disrupting speech. First question, a student group opposed to the speaker disrupts the speech by loudly and repeatedly shouting so the audience cannot hear the speaker. Do you agree or disagree with those actions? 51% of the students said, yes, I agree with that, that's acceptable. And 49% said no. For those who say yes, my opinion is that that's a form of censorship. It's not government imposed, but by a group of people who believe they know better than you. They have taken upon themselves to keep them or you from hearing something they've determined is going to be harmful for you, which to me is the largest form of arrogance that I know of. The alternative, which is based in liberty, is don't go. Okay? Don't be so arrogant in thinking you know what's best for everyone. Respect the individuality and self-determination of people to decide for themselves. Next question, a student group opposed to the speaker uses violence to prevent the speaker from speaking. Is that acceptable? Fortunately, only 19% said it was. And frankly, that's correct because that's criminal. That's a crime. Violence is not protected speech. Finally, if you had a choice to one of the options below, which do you think is more important for colleges to do? Create a positive learning environment for all students by prohibiting certain speech, or create an open learning environment where students are exposed to all types of speech and viewpoints? The statistics here indicate that the majority of people believe that an open campus, 53%, is correct. However, 43% say that no, certain speech should be prohibited. In my personal opinion, again, personal opinion also, 53% is way too high and 47% is way too low. Colleges are places where ideas are presented and challenged. Our mission statement, we believe by changing minds we can change the world. That is not, through censorship, regulations, minds will change. We believe by imposing rules we can change the world. I can find few examples where the imposition of authority alone has changed a mind for the better. So I think if we believe in our mission statement, we don't believe in telling you what to think and that your mind shouldn't be changed. If we started protecting students from hate speech, then we become holden to the definition of that term and have lost our mission as an institution of higher learning. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Our next panelist is Dr. E. Anthony White. He has been a professor here of criminal justice for 7 years, though his total teaching career spans over 20 years. He has also spent 28 years in law enforcement, with several of them in the federal drug interdiction. Dr. White is also a retired police officer and a U.S. veteran. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. White.
It's probably easy to stand. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for having me, Paul, and the distinguished panel here. My learned colleagues before me are quite articulate. What I want to address with the free speech, protected speech as well, is I want to go into the classroom itself. There's much information on how we're going to try to deal with it on the campuses itself, but again, each side has so much, information and so much input. If you're a constitutionalist, keep that free speech just how it is. Everyone can say what they need to say, with those few exceptions. Probably like 9 different categories, the way we might, if you want to break it down to an extent. And some speech we clearly know, as articulated by the two colleagues before me, we clearly can't have speech directed fighting and violence, one on someone specifically directed at them. But we also want to hear the opinions, and we value the opinions of other people. I'm sorry, that's where we live, and that's what makes the country a better place. If you've lived in other countries and you suppress speech, it's not a nice place to live, all right? As it relates to the classroom environment, it's just kind of a sticky issue there. I teach primarily criminal justice and sociology. And in those areas, it's a pretty volatile subject if left unchecked, both of them, with the disparities and types of policing and everything that we hear with numbers and what's going on in our communities. It reflects and it actually surfaces within these classrooms that we teach these subject matters. There are issues that rise as to races, sexual orientation, gender issues, even to what we were just talking about with the Brookings. Interestingly enough, with that survey, if you look at how women voted compared to men, it's a huge difference in how women feel in terms of violence as well as to protected speech issues. But in the classroom itself, where I'm more familiar with, let's say, what I wanted to speak about today, I say that you have to encourage free speech, even on the most sensitive subjects. Why? Because it is a learning environment. Why we need to somehow or another provide more information, not always telling someone how to think, but give more information so that there's an alternative to what's being expressed in that classroom. And much of what they spoke about, there's always that other half. Give information to quench that bad information if you deem it bad. You'll find that students in classrooms sometimes say things in such a way as to many people are offended. But a lot of times, because of their youth and their exuberance and their excitement in the subject matter, they said it kind of like harshly. Not to be mean and hurtful to people, but it's the way they said it. They try to get another way to say a thing. We all know those famous euphemisms, but when you're growing up, they're not so evident or right on your taste buds to spit it out on your tongue. I found that I say that it's the instruction, the way that we teach as professors, that kind of curtails and encourages certain types of behavior and speech patterns and speech content, period. We create the culture in these classrooms. I find that when we use neutral words, especially on sensitive subjects, and we're not so quick to espouse our particular opinions on matters, you get more encouraging feedback, but respectful. For instance, for me, myself personally, I refuse to curse in a classroom. I never have yet. Not even the ASS word, no word. I just don't. Why? Because there's a time and place for everything. I make this known the first day of class, and I expect my students to imitate, replicate me. So if I'm not up there and I'm not cursing at all, that's one way of letting them know there's a time and place for everything, as was mentioned earlier. This sets a stage and a climate within a classroom then that people might be a little bit more conscious of what they say and how they say it. Just to be flippantly using negative words, I'm not going to call a student out if they use the ASS word or the S word. I'm not going to do that. It depends on the context they're using it in. But clearly, if they're using it in such a way as to disrupt the classroom, now we've got the issue. Because the issue is, if you're disrupting with your speech, and the other people are being deprived of a learning because we're concentrating on these foul words that are coming out of your mouth, now we have an issue with what we're speaking about here, free speech and protected speech. I take that angle and that approach. It hasn't happened yet, but it's clear one that I can take through calling. It's a disruption going on in the classroom based on what the students are saying. It hasn't happened yet, because I go back to the culture that we create in the classrooms for many. When we having discourses over who's arrested and how long and what the prison system looks like demographically, those are pretty serious subject matters to teach to students when you're talking about black and white issues and and who's getting locked up and why and what's happening with criminal justice across the nation, with policing in communities and whatnot. These are topics we talk about. Yet for some reason or another, I'm not running into hate speech. I'm not saying that there aren't students in the classroom who feel certain ways, but if I'm not espousing that, understand that, I'm not asking for that or creating an environment that you could say anything because you have free speech. Oh no, it can never happen. I still say that I challenge our professors just to stay on top of how we say what we say, set guidelines ahead of time. You're not limiting, you're not taking away anyone's right. It is protected speech for students to say, but it's how we say things. And if we create an environment or we tolerate or look the other way when someone says something asinine, well, you know, sometimes you just have to say a few words and speak. There are people in here. I start off many discussions with saying in sociology, in this class, there are 50 students here on a Wednesday night. I can tell you now, out of 50 students, we will have several people that are not of the same sexual orientation as you. Well, now we've got it out there. So when we get to topics on sexuality and stuff, I don't want to hear things, words that we use in our homes or with our friends after 2 bears have gone down. I don't want to hear it in here because you're going to offend people. I cannot stop you, but if the stage is set and I'm not using those words and I'm already showing love to everyone in the classroom as it relates to subject matter, students replicate, imitate. They want to be like their professors. We shape minds. We shape minds in those classrooms, and the way that we teach clearly has to support the idea to get students to speak, but it's how they say, what they write and whatnot. College campuses have always been a place for discourse, whether we like it or not. Many of us in here survived the Vietnam War. We've seen it across the country. We've seen it all the way back to colonial times prior to the Constitution, taxation. We want to speak. We want representation. This is not new, but it's how we respond to it, how we create the environment that curtails that. Laws will always be there, but people have to feel it. That's my thing.
Our next speaker is Dr. Rita Ali. She's Vice President of Diversity and Community Impact at ICC. She serves as chairwoman of the Peoria Advisory Committee on Police Community Relations and president of the Martin Luther King Holiday Committee of Peoria. Dr. Ali is well recognized for her work in justice and equality. In 2012, she worked with local and state officials to organize this area's first hate crime summit, held at the PAC here at ICC. A warm welcome to Rita.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. First, I want to commend the team of faculty that put this event together. I think that this is just the type of dialogue that we need right now, especially at a time when there's so much unrest as it relates to politics, as it relates to race, gender, transgender, as it relates to religion. Some of the groups that are most targeted these days are Muslims and minorities and transgender individuals. So I think it's very timely, and really I'd like to see more of this type of events and activities on campus. My office handles, first I want to say that I agree with everything that I've heard from those gentlemen who spoke before me. I rely on the advice, legal advice of Rick Joseph down there as our board attorney, and I bounce a lot of things by him before going forth with certain decisions. And I just respect all these gentlemen and Emily as well. The only disagreement that I have is that when it came to the court's decision on burning that cross, the man that burned the cross in that yard, I would have been with that same judge that voted against that person that committed that terrible crime, in my opinion. My office handles complaints of discrimination that relate to potential violations of Title VI and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and also Title IX of the U.S. education law. Title VI prevents discrimination by government agencies that receive federal funds. And as you know, we receive federal funds in many different forms in terms of programs as well as financial aid, loans, Pell Grants, and other forms of federal funding for different activities that take place in our education. Title VII prevents discrimination by covered employers on the basis of race and color and religion, also sex and national origin, age, pregnancy, and disability. Veteran status applies in some of these cases. But again, that is employers that employ 15 or more employees and also that receive federal funding. And violations to these laws could cause an institution to lose federal funding. Okay. Title IX says that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And again, that applies to us, and there's various laws that protect protect individuals from sex discrimination at our institution. So these are laws. I'm not an attorney, but I do read into the laws that govern this institution and affect my area. Again, it's not an easy job, but it's one that's very important to protect individuals and also to protect our organization. You may know of some organization that has some schools, colleges that have lost or been threatened to lose their federal funding because of violations to these particular laws. Complaints to my office are primarily in the form of employee complaints against supervisory or administrative actions or decisions, or student complaints against faculty or staff. Student-to-student complaints are usually not handled by my office. They usually go to the Division of Student Affairs and somehow end up in Emily's office. However, sometimes I'm called in to help to mediate a situation, especially if it relates to a diversity issue. When we receive a complaint from protected class individuals, we talk to the individual and determine if someone wants to try to resolve something that may be easily resolved internally, or if they want to file a formal complaint that may remain and get resolved in-house, or it may end up going externally to another division outside of the college. I believe that free speech becomes hate speech when it targets individuals based on bias. That bias would be someone's race or skin color, their national origin, their religion, their gender or sexual orientation, or their disability. I think it's one thing to hold peaceful protests and express your hatred, but it's another when that speech or those actions become threatening to someone, or they lead to harassment or taunting someone, fighting words was used, or they deface property. In some cases, when it comes to defacing property or threatening, it can be considered a hate crime. I think that much of the hate rhetoric can be addressed through policies such as student and employee code of conduct regulations, anti-bullying policies, and classroom behavior expectations like Dr. White spoke of. And I heard Scott talk about time and place, and that's where I think in the college we can definitely use time and place in terms of code of conduct, in terms of how someone behaves, whether it's in the classroom or on campus. There's certain disruptive behavior that may impede the learning process, and that really cannot be tolerated. And so it may not be considered hate speech or hate behavior, but it can be very disruptive and really not be tolerated based upon code of conduct rules that we have. Again, while students have the right to express themselves and their views, they don't have the right to exert behaviors that impede the learning of other students. As classroom and campus leaders, I think that we have an obligation to teach tolerance, and this can be done without compromising First Amendment rights. Some of you may have attended an event on Bradley's campus a few weeks ago, and it was given by the Southern Poverty Law Center. They're an organization that fights against hate. They teach tolerance. They're very effective at what they do, and it was a packed house there. And they have a great website, by the way, but they have a number of publications that are very useful. This one is called 10 Ways to Fight Hate. They talk about not just turning a blind eye to hate speech and hate behavior, but speaking up and taking steps to address it. By ignoring it, the haters win. Okay? But there's a lot of good information here. There's also critical practices for anti-bias education. And I share these things to say that we are looking at bringing a representative from the Southern Poverty Law Center here in the spring to provide training for employees, faculty and staff, as well as for students. And I think that that's going to be a very useful training activity or professional development, personal development program that we'll have this coming spring. And last, I'll end by saying that, I just want to show you something in this book because it's very powerful. It's an image here, and it's an image of a little child in a Ku Klux Klan uniform. Okay, very small child. And it's at a Klan rally in Georgia, and the child goes up to play with the shield that the black state trooper is holding. And the image reads, just as children can learn to hate, we know that they can learn acceptance and understanding. And I truly believe that. I worked at Bradley at the time. White supremacist Matt Hell was very active on campus. He had already graduated from Bradley, but he still had a following. And he would come back on campus, and he wasn't restricted from it. He was an alumni. He would come back on campus, and his followers would come out, and they would protest. And he couldn't participate in the protest, but he could be there. His presence was very powerful. And then there would be counter-protests on campus. But it never failed, and there was nothing that we could do about it, but allow for the peaceful protests. But it never failed that sometimes shortly after those protests, somebody would do something that would go against Bradley policy or that would go against the law. You know, a day later we saw a black image hanging from a dorm room on a noose. You know, that happened. And then somebody defaced the property of the campus and another student, so they committed a crime. But it never fails that hate behavior sometimes turns into a violation of a code of conduct or a crime. So I say let's stand up against hate, continue to teach and support tolerance, and often embrace diversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. Our last speaker is Emily Points. She's our Dean of Students here at ICC and just graduated with her doctoral degree in community college leadership.
Way to go.
She has been at ICC for 17 years.
There's more?
The Student Code of Conduct is one of Emily's main responsibilities, ensuring that students comply with and understand college policies related to student conduct.
No.
You can come up now.
Okay, good afternoon. So I'm just going to say ditto to everybody what they said. So no, I'm just joking. But Rita and I work very closely on these cases if they do happen on campus. Rita and I are sidekicks together, or Dr. Moore. So But as far as student code of conduct, if everybody wants to know where it's at, okay, it's on the website. If you go to the Students tab, it's under Student Services, you can find the code of conduct. For faculty and staff, if you go to ICC.net, it's right under faculty. You'll see it, it's a hyperlink. And then each academic department has a hard copy of it. So if you ever want to look at it, you can go to one of those 3 spots. Also on page 9 of the Code of Conduct is all the prohibited conduct. It's about a list of 27, 28 items. It goes into detail. Some of the items are bullying, cyberbullying, inappropriate behavior online or in the classroom, theft, possession or carrying of weapons, including knives, 3 inches or more, sexual harassment, sexual assault, sexual misconduct, gang activity, violation of federal, state, or local law, and then abuse of computer facilities, unauthorized use of electronic devices, especially cell phones in the classroom, and hazing. Those are a few of them. I will tell you there's a lot more if you guys want to look at the Code of Conduct. But also in the Code of Conduct, it talks about student organization responsibility and the actual process that we follow when a report is submitted to me. If you don't know where to report it, if you go to the website and you go under faculty, useful documents, and then there's a hyperlink right there, okay? If you need help, you can always call me and I will tell you where it's at, or your deans should know where it's at also. So after a report is made, I usually, most frequently, I speak to both parties. So if it's 2 students, if it's a faculty member and a student, I usually speak to both of them. And to get the both sides of the story. There's always 2 sides to every story. You know, what happened, I need to know. But after that, after I talk to both parties, I will, between myself or the student conduct committee, will make a decision. And as far as what sanction needs to be imposed, okay? Sanctions can be from disciplinary warning to more severe expulsion, suspension, and we also have interim suspensions, okay? And those can be put in place also. Lastly is we do have a behavioral intervention team, and we meet monthly to review cases, and we work through trainings on various topics. The team is called upon if appeals are requested, and then the members of the team are the hearing discipline board, in which include 3 faculty members, 2 which are here, Dr. White and Margot Vance, and then we have 1 academic dean, campus police are on it, counseling's on it, athletics, and then myself. So that is the board. But in any case, if you have this happen in class, I would highly recommend you go and fill out the form. In Maxient, it's called Maxient, that's our student database for academic integrity, police reporting, my reporting, everything's in one spot. But if it does come through, then I will direct it usually towards Rita, and we will work together to figure out the solution. So we do interviews with students together, or if it's more of her issue, discrimination, Rita will deal with it. I will kind of step back, and if she does need me, then we communicate. So there you go. Thanks.
So let's give a hand to all the panelists again for their excellent insights. And now is a question and answer period, so I'm pretty flexible how we want to do this. If you want to come to the mic, that would be one thing. If you want to write it down, Megan or Aaron would come by and pick up your question. It's really what we want to do. Okay, Susan.
Oh, yeah.
I could just shout in my teaching voice. Hello.
It's on.
It's on.
I'll just yell.
It's on.
I have this semester. I'm Susan Hellbold. I teach in the humanities department, and this semester I'm teaching English 111, which is the argument class, and we're focusing on post-truth, fake news, alternate truths, alternate facts. And so some of these issues are going to come up. Now my question is, what if I have a student who wears but he wears it every class. Where is the line between harassment and free speech? That's my question. And what if a student comes up to me and says, you know, Joe sitting next to me keeps wearing this Confederate flag. I'm offended by it. But I have to say, this is free speech. He can wear it. But where does that line draw? Where do I say this is harassment or is this free speech? That's my question.
Let me try to address that. Unfortunately for you, there is no bright line distinction. I'd like to be able to tell you, other than tell this young man he needs to wash his clothes more often.
Because he has one shirt.
Because if he's wearing it every day. But there is unfortunately no bright line distinction. You can, again, you look at it in the context of you have a classroom, so you have a limited public forum. Okay, you have ideas that need to be expressed. And your class, you are actually looking to foster the expression of those ideas. Speech, free speech goes beyond just mere words. I mean, so clothing, buttons, things like that. Again, a person, unfortunately, is entitled to wear the Confederate flag just like a student is entitled to wear a button saying, I support Democrats, or a button that says, I hate Republicans, or kill all the lawyers. Okay, that's the only one I think should be protected. but again, unfortunately, there is no bright line distinction. Now, I want to carry that one step further because let's take this in terms of, let's suppose it's speech, or somebody, there was a comment made before about somebody writing something on the whiteboard. Again, you look at this a little bit in context of what this is. I mean, your classroom is not the public forum in terms of what the courtyard is or the quad. You're there for a purpose. Now, if you're teaching an algebra class and somebody is drawing swastikas or writing things on the board, I think you are within your limits and rights to remove those and to say that is not appropriate because the purpose of this forum is algebraic equations. Now, if your class is one upon culture or European history or perhaps what you're doing in terms of fostering discussion, it's a lot harder for you to say, even though this is a limited public forum, you're going to preclude one aspect of discussion because in a limited public forum, you can still do that, but it has to be content neutral. So.
And I would just add to that, Susan, that I agree with Rick. Sometime after Charlottesville, a government agency released a list of hate groups in America. And I went through that list, and I was surprised to see some of the common ones were the Ku Klux Klan, but then on the later part, there was Black Lives Matter. Many people, including myself, don't believe that Black Lives Matter is a hate group, but that federal government agency and many people in America do believe that. So there are people that wear Black Lives Matter shirts, just like there are people that wear Confederate flag shirts. Some people embrace it and some people are offended by it, yet,
That would be an interesting thing to look up with fake news, because I've just been reading that Russia Today, RT News, is putting out a lot of stuff on fake, on Black Lives Matter, so that's why it got a bad reputation. I'm sure that Bannon and Trump listened to his fake news, so that would be a good example of fake news and how it actually made it into government policy.
That's true.
The one thing I would add, the case that Rick mentioned earlier is Tinker versus Des Moines. During the Vietnam War, 2 students went to class wearing a black armband. And the courts ruled that speech was not disruptive in any way. So I would guess, and that's through K through 12. K through 12, there are a lot more restrictions. You're in loco parentis with those students, and you can regulate them a lot more. Not so much in college. So I think if your student wears a Confederate shirt, and I disagree with Rick, he said unfortunately, I would say fortunately. You now have a learning moment. And there's actually a cartoon going around on Facebook that I almost brought, but it's really good. And it basically shows, I'm going to do the cartoon backwards, with the student with the Confederate flag. Do you think you're sending a message? Okay, get out an American flag and stand on it. See how that goes over. And the cartoon has basically students standing on the American flag saying, oh, that's improper free speech. And then they get out their Confederate flag and say, oh, but that offends me. So you have a teachable moment there to show the power of symbolic speech.
This might piggyback off of that. Maybe instead of the threshold between when they've done it too much and it becomes harassment, what's the, Scott, you talked about holding up a sign as being a personal attack. When does it stop being hate speech and start being threatening speech? So I'm thinking about, I was a student here, now I'm faculty, but as a student here, I was in a class where we were talking about social issues, and several students in the class looked at me and said, fags don't deserve to lie, don't deserve to live, looked me in the eyes, and then did this, right? Like, they were all doing these gestures at me. So at what point does it stop being generic hate speech and pointed, threatening, silencing work? And I think that might be, in particular, in the classroom, the kinds of issues we're going to have to try to mitigate.
Generally, what I would do in those circumstances is you have a crime. There are crimes of intimidation.
But is it all hate speech an act of intimidation?
No, because hate speech, that's the problem with the word speech is it's protected by the First Amendment. And frankly, there's no legal recognition of something called hate speech. The Rav decision in Minneapolis, and Rita would have voted the other way. That doesn't mean that 14-year-old didn't escape prosecution. He was prosecuted for criminal damage to property and for other criminal offenses, but not for the conduct of the content of the speech per se. If you believe you are an imminent threat of being harmed, you have been assaulted. That's the crime of assault. And something like that, I got somebody kicked out of a football game once because of that. That's another story. But I mean, if you are in reasonable belief that you're about ready to receive a battery or to be physically harmed, that's a crime. You call those folks, they're gone.
Just to close the loop, so that you all were, I was the one asked to leave the class because I was the disruption. So I went to the next class. I had a signed drop slip. Granted, this was 2000, but I was handed a signed drop slip and told that my presence was a disruption from the learning that needed.
I'd take that case.
Well, it happened on this campus.
I'd take that case.
I would too.
These conversations are occurring now.
Yeah, before my time.
Oh, good, even better.
Well, that's here.
I have a quick story that somewhat relates to that. When I was first hired here, my boss at the time asked me to take a final to basically supervise a final of an intro to literature class at the downtown campus. And I found out later the reason why I took that class is because the female literature teacher felt threatened by one of the students and didn't want to feel threatened. So they had me come in and take the class, which I thought was really interesting. I thought, that's backward. Why is the teacher not here? Because she's feeling threatened, and they're not removing the student who was doing the threatening. But that was a shocker when I found out later.
Potential Title IX.
Other questions?
So, for those who don't know, one of my students this week, their next paper involves interviewing strangers. And she came to me and she was like, Baldridge, I'm not going to be able to do this assignment. I was like, yes, you can. It's a little scary talking to people, but you can totally do it. And she's like, no, you don't understand. I can't do it. I was like, what's going on? And so she pulled me aside and said that over the weekend, she and her friend were leaving. She's a woman of color. She and her friend were pulling out of the review parking lot. And the gentlemen who were pulling out behind them apparently didn't think they were going fast enough. And they swooped around and aimed a Nazi salute at the women in the car. And now this student is afraid of, understandably afraid of approaching people on campus. And so my question is, like, okay, so this is very clearly a threat, but can we divorce the history of Nazi Germany from that gesture? Isn't that also a threat to her safety? She is afraid, so if the issue is whether she is, fearful for her safety, that part is covered.
Well, the Constitution doesn't really address the point of the victim, to be honest with you. And that speech is going to be protected. This is a unique question because my heritage, I'm German. My grandfather was a member of the German army, fought in the Battle of Stalingrad. And there are laws in European countries that prohibit you from denying the Holocaust. I disagree with those laws terribly because it censors speech. And again, we have a teachable moment. If you would suppress speech and say we're not allowed to talk about Nazism or that sort of thing, you deny the opportunity to teach this way. This is what Nazi Germany stood for. And you teach this by addressing speech with better speech, with more speech. As far as your particular student goes, I think she might have rights under the law, but as far as somebody giving what appears to be a Nazi salute, that is not the kind of thing that we can prohibit somebody to do. It certainly gives us the opportunity to educate that person, if we can find them, and provide that moment.
Can I expand further?
Please.
We're hearing quite a bit about the term that I used earlier. I'm a constitutionalist and straight here, the First Amendment all the way down. There's still another group of people in our society that clearly articulate and argue quite robustly that there are marginalized and alienated groups of people that typically are on the other side of all of this free speech, that feel threatened and they won't come to campuses. And the story that you just told us, that's actually in case law as well. My learned friends, they're attorneys, they should be familiar. There are case laws that have come through where students that come to school, they should not be made to feel afraid, frightened, and et cetera, by such behavior as well. So this falls under what we call critical race theory as well, not to get bogged down with that now, but not to make light of it either, but just, I don't want to go there. What I mean is that that's an aggressive form that people are saying we have to start to look at how we're going to protect these other victims in this, who are typically women, people of different sexual orientations, and minority groups that are on the other side that are feeling the brunt of much of this as well.
Well,
So
that's what some of my frustration was. Okay, fine, First Amendment rights, but where do those start to interfere with my student's right to feel safe in her home? She lives at Woodview, the men live there also, and feel safe where she is studying.
Yeah, I'm of the opinion that we can't ignore that situation, that she should be encouraged to come forth, to talk to myself, to talk to Emily, because we have, as students, the students who, had that gesture live on campus, they're students at ICC, and there are certain codes of conduct in living on campus and being a student, and impeding the learning process. And so I think that that's how we would have to address that, but she would have to be willing to come forth.
also with Woodview, as everyone here is pretty much aware, I think it was just a couple of months ago, somebody else over there was called a coon on Woodview. So that's not, this type of behavior then, as this is the forum to speak about it, that type of behavior then is not an isolated incident, when only, I think it was less than 2 months ago that we were told this happened as well.
We had a situation in downtown campus where an individual of Indian descent was told to go back to where she came from, So those kinds of activities are happening on our campus, and I would say more so in recent days or weeks than before.
I don't know if it will come out of this or what it would look like exactly, but by mentioning it, I'm signing up to do the work. I would also really like ICC to do something proactive, so instead of reactive, something to build a culture that makes it known that that isn't welcome, and that all of these people who make up this student body are.
Absolutely.
That's what I really liked about in the video at the very end where the student was speaking about having education seminars and things like that. I thought that was like teachable times. Speaking of teachable moments that Scott was mentioning earlier, last semester I had a night class and we were talking about the immigrant experience. It was an article we read, and this white male, I don't think his intention was to be racist, but it was racist to Mexicans, and I had a Mexican in the classroom. And Scott, I missed that teachable moment, and because I was so shocked, and I was watching the Mexican student, and he didn't react, but I feel badly that I missed that moment, that he didn't even know he was being racist, if that makes sense. The white male didn't even know it, and I froze and missed that opportunity, but we have them. Yeah.
There's a lot of implicit racism, and they're unaware that they're racist, but they're used to it, they're the family.
Yeah.
And so what you have to do is draw out that that's implicit racism and explain the way.
Just to follow up, Elizabeth, this summer I worked with David Crossett, and we did a welcome campaign, a video. I don't know if you guys have seen it. The president sent it out. So we created that, and it has all different race, ethnicities, gender, non-traditional, traditional students. So we created that for this purpose. Okay. Now I don't know how many students have seen it, but that's why we did it, because ICC will accept any student on campus. So I think it does need to be out there for more students to watch, because that's why we created it, for this reason. So that was one step.
It was great, yeah.
I'm Dane Parkhurst. I'm with the Harbinger. Just to kind of snowball off of that conversation, Dr. Ali mentioned teaching tolerance. I was just wondering, how simple is that? Is it just saying no? And then also, how do we encourage diversity? I know you mentioned something, but is there anything amongst students that we're encouraging?
I think the best way to teach tolerance is through dialogue, where people can speak their minds, talk about their backgrounds and their beliefs and why they believe the way that they believe, so that we can begin to understand prejudice and where it came from and how to deal with it. Some years ago, we had what we call diversity study circles, and it involved students, faculty, and staff taking different topic areas of diversity and going into small groups of 8 to 12 people and talking about these issues. And they were, from religion to body size, and just all different types of topics. And then we came out with findings and action plans. One of those action plans resulted in a program called Harvesting Dreams that we still have. It addressed issues of the African American male. But I think that's what we need to have more of, is more sessions of dialogue. And we're looking at ways to do that and how to engage both students and employees.
Oh, you have a question? Can you come to the mic, please? Thank you.
I am actually with Anthony White. He's my criminal justice teacher. My name is Nikki, and one of my main questions is how do you differentiate free speech with bullying?
Oh, don't look at me.
Sounds like a legal question to me.
Let me take a shot at that. Okay, it's a very good question, and one it's also very difficult. The difference is bullying, in most sense, can be attributed more towards what one attribute to be a fighting word. It's a personal, one-on-one attack. That's different. That would cause a reasonable person, not any person, but the law of this mythical reasonable person, to say that that I am in fear of some action here. That is the aspect where bullying crosses the line from being free speech to something which is more of a fighting word. Does that help? Probably not, because again,
Okay,
it's hard.
Give you an
Yeah.
example. I mean, this is actually a personal experience. I was in high school, and I know college is a lot different than high school. But my sister had a parent who committed suicide way back in 2008, and a student had come up to me and said, "I see why your dad killed himself. I would kill myself too if you were my daughter." I told her, careful who you say that to. And I told her, I said, I'll come after you. You say to the wrong person. I was doing all this for protecting my older sister. She didn't know it at the time. Well, I also had gone to a counselor. I went to the principal. And my mom even called and said, what can be done here? And they said, well, we don't want to say anything to the student because we don't want to make this issue worse. 2 weeks later, the student said it to my sister. I got in trouble for fighting the student, but at the same time, I also didn't get as much trouble as the student did because they said, well, yeah, it was a bully. But if they would have did something prior, that situation could have been avoided. So how is that considered?
All 4 teachable moments, right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, Scott is right. I mean, they are teachable moments. If you're asking what the law provides, unfortunately, again, Scott doesn't like that word because it gets rid of the teachable moment. But in my opinion, the law does not allow the law to step in, and therefore the state, in other words, the school, to say, on the basis of free speech, you cannot say that to that individual. Now, that comment, while hurtful, while horrid, is not something which, in my opinion, is actionable by the state.
Right.
You know, so that's a little bit different than the aspect of where someone would say personal insult directed right at the individual where you have a concern. You know, if someone said to my wife, short little lady, I'm going to beat you because you're married to a Lebanese guy and I don't like Lebanese guys, and she was afraid and she took us, you know, that to me crosses the line. That's a hate speech aspect. Personal attack, fearful, somebody to carry it forward, and it based upon race. Unfortunately, what you described is not fitting in that category.
Correct. But my next thing would be to say, like, you're somewhere, you're in class or anywhere, and somebody says, like this guy says, all facts should die. And if later on he gone somewhere and he got attacked, and it's considered a hate crime, correct?
If he got attacked for saying all facts should die? No.
I got attacked by those guys.
Oh, by those guys. If basically there's a crime of assault and battery, and generally it's aggravated by the presence of facts that support the reason for the assault and battery was going after somebody for a protected class. That's interesting too, because right now, at least in federal law, sexual orientation is not one of those protected classes, by the way, which is another story, but to some extent, that's federal law. That might be a hate crime.
It is in Illinois.
Yeah, federal law, it's not.
Any more questions?
Illinois law.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
So I love this idea, right? We want to censor that which we can't fix. Let's just, right? I don't know how to fix the stove, so let's get rid of the stove. Let's pretend like the stove never existed, right? And the alternative to this censorship is teachable moments. But I think most people are afraid, right? Like most of my colleagues, I teach communication, and I confront language in my class. I have my students write the most vile, awful, horrible things you can think to call another human being, and then we look to see how those languages work. But my students keep talking about how, right, like, and then two conclusions my students come to is that there's linguistic inequality, and that's one of the reasons that makes this super uncomfortable. There are hateful single words you can use to describe marginalized people that don't go the opposite direction, so it's hard to police that. My students have, right, like it's hard for my students.
There is no good swear word against white people.
Correct. There's no good straight
Cracker
word
is
against
as bad as it
heterosexual
gets,
men.
and that's
Right.
not bad.
So there's a laundry list of identity categories, right, that for very political reasons, there aren't words that stick. In fact, at one point, I teach my students that at one point, straight was an insult, right? Like it was the retort to being called queer, and most of my students go, really? Because I'm proud that I'm straight. I go, of course you are. It doesn't work in the opposite direction.
Right.
So my students come to this conclusion that one of the reasons hate speech just makes us so uncomfortable is because it's unidirectional.
Right.
It doesn't work in both ways.
That's a good
and then the
point.
other thing that my students try to come to is that we have a failure of accountability, right? We've confused the belief that freedom of speech means accountable-less speech, right? Like that you're not responsible for the things that you say. And so my students they're not inventing these words.
Right.
They're bound by their histories. And so my teachable moment in my class is to have my students become aware of what are the histories you're dependent on in order for these words to hurt, in order for these words to sting, or even make sense, right? And we do a wide range of them. Perhaps maybe the next call right after this is to start having conversations about how these teachable moments exist on this campus, how to connect them to each other, and how to motivate, equip, prepare more of them to exist. Because I can tell you, I've had several observations, because I'm pre-tenure, so I get watched a lot. And this is something that I said, I'm going to get in trouble for this someday, because my students are using a language that is offensive, but we're using it for educational purposes. I want everyone who is above me to see it. So my mentor committee has all seen me teach this, my dean has seen me teach this, so they can all go, oh, okay, so if somebody comes to me and says, you said the N-word in class, I understand. But I've also, all of my colleagues have said, I could never do that. I could never have teachable moments like that in my class, because they feel at risk. And that's not totally separate from the first instance, or the first experience that I had. So I think that maybe a conversation about what these teachable moments should and could look like might be a worthwhile next step. We're not going to censor this speech. Let's at least have conversations about what we should do with it on this campus.
Just as a point, I still go back to what I was mentioning earlier. We create the cultures in these classrooms. And the sooner we take ownership of that, the easier it gets. We actually create the culture. We are responsible. We are the professional. These are kids. The brains are still developing, 26 years old, 25, some longer. Mine are at least. So what I mean by that in a serious tone is that the way that we present and the way that we speak and the way that we teach, you're setting the stage for a lot of what comes back at you. And like I said, I'm teaching in a pretty interesting field. It's criminal justice. I'm an African American, and most of my students, 9 out of 10, are white students, okay? And they're young males and females. And then we're speaking about subject matters that are very sensitive. I mean, extremely so. Yet we're getting there, and we're doing it without a whole lot of issues in terms of we're not suppressing ideas. It's how we're talking about these ideas and appreciating one another. I go back and I just say it's the culture. Each of us individually go in there and the way we present material. If we're making it obvious how we feel about something, trust me, students attach to that and they'll blow it up. They will blow it up, and they will go far with that if left alone. So even for your class, if it works for communications, what you're teaching, and you're bringing students together and appreciating one another while respecting that right to speech, go for it. I mean, that looks different than math or business maybe for my learned colleague here. It looks different in each class. If you're teaching math, you're not going to have, you shouldn't have as many moments as what was said earlier about disrupting a classroom. You're not going to have those types of race and sexual orientation topics come up. Does that make sense, I hope? From one colleague to another. So you're in charge of that, and I don't think you have to, like, what do you call it, be sorry about what you're teaching.
I'm not at all apologetic.
Right.
No, I mean, so people that wouldn't understand you.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is we have figured out this path, but maybe it's worthwhile for us to have conversations with other people so they can also figure out how to do it, right? I mean, I know that I have students who will say, I don't know how to have a conversation about transgender, so I'm just not going to do it.
Right.
Right.
And I'll I've got a copy of this, extra copies. I'll give it, it's an op-ed piece from the New York Times, September 24th, The Dying Art of Disagreement. Yeah. And it talks all about putting things in contexts. And if anyone wants the link, I'll give it to Paul, or you can ask me for it. Answers a lot of, I think, those questions that you raised.
Okay, Megan?
So I have a question that's sort of related to that. It's almost the opposite of that in some ways. I'm in the humanities department, by the way. But I'm curious about how far we actually get to go in terms of creating that classroom culture. So for example, I will swear in class, never at students. Never at students, and that's always very clear. No one ever swears at each other in my classroom, but every once in a while, as someone's trying to express an idea, it just sort of comes out, and I don't want them to feel weird about that. And I also teach film, and we teach a lot of R-rated films where it's just going to come up because we're talking about it. But there are other times where these more sensitive issues come up, and words are getting thrown out, and you're like, whoa, okay, hold up. Like, we need to be respectful while having this conversation. So how much can be covered by, you need to be respectful to everyone in the classroom, versus where you're starting to shut down this First Amendment right?
Just in one sentence, just to clarify with the swearing, I tell them I don't swear because I want them to learn to express themselves without vulgarity. Because they go into the courtrooms, they're dealing with people. That's why I tell them I don't swear. I want them to learn other words to show, and they do swear sometimes. You know what I mean? That's why I don't do it. There are other words. That's the only reason.
When it happens too often in my classroom, I do the exact same thing where I'm like, okay, you're celebrating this a little bit too much. Like, let's have a chat about it.
I've noticed I've been swearing in statistics class a lot more because it's statistics. I've said I swear too much because it's statistics, but that's another question.
Megan, as it relates to complaints that I get from students about faculty, it's usually not about cursing in class. It's about singling students out based upon their gender or their particular group that they belong to, and being offensive in those types of ways, but not about using a cuss word here and there. It's mostly when a student feels singled out and is offended based upon some bias that they feel is taking place.
I guess my question is more about student-to-student interactions in particular, when I have to step in, like if a student's saying something, you're like, whoa, we can have that conversation, that's fine, we can open that up, but I'm going to ask that we use more respectful language as we do it.
You regulate.
Yeah,
I think you are fine to regulate that. Again, you are not censoring a message. You are fostering discussion. It's just that you are asking people to be respectful in terms of how they engage in that discussion. And it's a fine line, but I think that you are fine to do that, and I think you should be applauded for doing that.
Well, I'll be honest with you, I want another hour, because this is really interesting, and it just raises, for me, a lot more questions, but they also answered a lot of really good questions. So one more round of applause for our panelists, and thank you, everybody. Thank you to everybody in this audience for coming on a Thursday from 3:30 to 5. I know that's hard to do for some of you. So thank you for everybody, and thanks again to the panelists.
Thank you, Paul.
Question for you.